In this part of the presentation, we are going to look at motivations for dating app use as they were reported in our survey. We'll also talk about some of the disappointments and some of the other issues that we're interested in. So can you? Right. So we gave participants a list of motivations that we generated from the previous literature and previous research. And these are the top 4. Now, participants could actually choose more than one. So if they were saying dating, they could also be dating for sex, to meet someone for sex, or dating for a long-term relationship, or dating for friends. And of course, killing time, where people just browse through their dating apps just as something to do to stave off boredom.
And as we've interviewed people, we've come to realize that oftentimes people don't know their motivation for going onto dating apps, and that oftentimes their motivation may vary. So they may go onto a dating app to find a date, but they may find somebody really hot and end up having a hookup, or they may find somebody who's not really hot and end up having a friend. So it varies, and it's not always easy to answer these kinds of questions in the survey. So that's a methodological point that we've learned.
I think I've got a slide about that, but we can skip that. So if we look at the motivations before, during, and after COVID-19 restrictions, I think this is relatively clear. The blue is heterosexual women. The orange, I think I'm slightly colorblind, is heterosexual men. Gray, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and queer women. That's not trans women, actually. And it's GBQ. Again, it should be GBQ, not GBT. Queer, bisexual, and gay men. So if we look at dating, what we find is that heterosexual men and heterosexual women are relatively close in terms of the priorities that they put on dating, in terms of their motivations. If we look at friends, that's beforehand, before the restrictions. If we look at friends, we find that heterosexual women are less interested, the blue line, are motivated, I should say, in making friends, while the other 3 are similarly motivated. If we look at killing time, what we find is that there's a range of different levels of motivation, and amongst GBT men, or GBQ men, I should say, that's the highest for GBQ men. What's striking is that the biggest difference in terms of motivation comes around sex, or dating for sex, or dating to meet someone for sex. It probably, knowing the kind of dating app cultures around gay, bisexual, and queer men, it's probably not surprising to most of you that many would prioritize that as their key motivation. And women's sexual desires, or the fact that they were pursuing or motivated to use dating apps for sex, were evident, certainly, amongst LGBTQ women. But if we look at the difference between heterosexual men, which is close to 50%, and heterosexual women, there is quite a massive difference. And so that difference is heterosexual women are 11.1%, I think, and heterosexual men are 50, close to 50%. So what we're going to do, if you put this on, is to think about how we've kind of conceptualized this when we then looked at the qualitative data as well, was that women, more women seem to be engaged or motivated by an intimate optimism. So some wanted, many women use the term proper relationship, those words, proper relationship. So, you know, that's open to interpretation, of course, but in this case, it says a permanent relationship sort of thing, some marriage and stuff like that. And another woman says, I'm almost looking for the one. You're wasting your time taking yourself off the market when the one might be overlooked. So there was that kind of sense of intimate optimism amongst women, but for this certain kind of intimacy. If we look at the next slide, I think the men's accounts can be characterized more in terms of intimate options. Okay, they were optimistic about the chance of meeting someone who also wanted sex or who wanted the kind of relationship they wanted. But sometimes, one man puts it, I'm looking for a life partner, and sometimes I'm looking for a lover. Another man puts it, sometimes that's all I want, a sexual connection. It seemed to satisfy me. So the sometimes is quite important here, in that these were options, but also there was a sense of, what's the term? A sense of opportunism as well, that, you know, I might be looking for a relationship, but if someone is there and they want to have sex, you know, why not? We'll go to the next slide. And then, as the point that Jaime was making earlier, there was intimate ambivalence. People who didn't know what they were looking for, who were probably more motivated by a sense of unknowing once, but secondly, also motivated by a sense of whatever arises might be something worth thinking about. Next. So the intimate outcomes then, how we've started to think about this, instead of thinking about intimacy as something that builds over time, which is kind of one of the definitions of intimacy, we started to think about it in terms of different kinds of intimacy. Sustained intimacy, which is reported by our participants as successful longer-term relationships by women, mostly with new partners or friends in personal or virtually. Obviously, men also were interested in this, but less so than heterosexual women, I should say. Circumstantial, where emotional, supportive, friend-like or physical relationships or intimate relationships could emerge in response to critical moments. And COVID-19 restrictions itself, as I said earlier, was a critical moment. There are also, as was referred to earlier, momentary intimacies, which didn't entail a big build-up or knowledge over time, but were actually one-off encounters, sexual or otherwise, or a brief but critical sense of connection. And so one person recounted post-divorce, post-separation, how they might have a conversation that would actually be very significant. And it might be significant to their imagination of what a relationship could be, should be, so on and so forth. And then there are unwanted intimacies. So those kind of harassing, abusive, intrusive, discriminatory intimacies. And I think the whole point about dating apps is that they can not only enter your phone, but they enter your psyche in a very different way. And someone can pursue that unwanted intimacy. The pursuer can keep doing that if they choose to. And because they're often anonymous and because of the difficulties of, certainly if people give their WhatsApp addresses and so on. And then there are the ambivalent intimacies. I don't know what I want. I don't know if I want sex, if I want a relationship, and so on.
And what's important to highlight here is that this is not a ranking in terms of, I can.
Yeah, sorry.
This is not a ranking. Momentary intimacies can be as significant as sustained long-term intimacies. So, and this is something LGBT and queer studies on cruising have shown, those short-lived, almost anonymous encounters can be very significant and important for people.
I'll talk a little bit about the downsides of using dating apps, according to especially the interviewees. So as Brian mentioned just a few minutes ago, there was a bit of inconsistencies between what women wanted and what men said that they want and what each side received. So especially among the heterosexual women, many of them expressed disappointment and frustration with dating apps because, again, as Brian mentioned, they wanted a proper relationship. They wanted the happily ever after love, and that is not what they ended up receiving most of the time on dating apps. And also, the men that they encountered sometimes said that that's what they're interested in, but ended up searching for something else. So for instance, we had an interviewee called Eden, obviously this is a pseudonym, who said that she had a nice date with a guy, but then he said that they can go to a hotel that he will pay for, which was definitely not what she wanted. Or Vicky, who also looked for something very serious and ended up getting people who just wanted to sext. Another part of that kind of frustration and disappointment was that using dating apps was hard work for our interviewees. It was not a fun, something that they do for fun in their pastime. It was something that they felt like they had to put a lot of effort into, and they really didn't want to. And didn't feel like they were gaining anything out of it. So some of our interviewees had an experience where they were in a relationship. Doesn't matter how they met their partner, but then when they finished that relationship, they not only had to deal with that heartbreak, but they also had to face with understanding that now they have to go back to that swamp that is dating apps and start talking to people again. So that was something that, for instance, happened to Alex, that said, I remember being single and thinking, oh my God, I've got to start this all over again. All this filtering, I can't be bothered. So again, as I said, this was not a fun activity. It wasn't something that people felt like they're gaining much out of, except frustration and disappointment. And another reason why this felt so arduous and so difficult was that there was just too much. Everything was superfluous. Too many dating apps, too many people, too many pictures to go through, but not a lot of information beyond that, not much depth beyond that. So for instance, Kamala, she said, you're essentially not writing, but you're swiping people based on their attractiveness when there's more to life than that.
I was going to say that yesterday in the advisory board that we held, one of our colleagues, Catherine Tronley from UCL, suggests that labor takes many forms. So there is emotional labor, there is COVID labor, particularly during COVID in terms of negotiating those risks and those safety precautions. There is caring labor for people to care for others and show emotional support for others. So that labor takes many different shapes and forms, and something we're quite interested in looking at in the future.
And other more difficulties or struggles that our interviewees faced was, for instance, the issue of trust and safety. So again, many heterosexual women talked about experiencing various degrees of harassment on dating apps, whether it's getting dick pics or getting any kind of verbal harassment. which again, none of these were solicited. So for instance, Elena was one of those interviewees who received a pic and she said, I didn't ask to see this. So this was another thing that interviewees, especially heterosexual women, talked about, that they had to negotiate with other people in order to feel safe. Another issue that was raised not as often was racism, maybe perhaps because of our interviewees pool, but we had interviewees who said that they were faced with hurtful words in relation to their ethnicity. And one last thing in relation to this is, again, issues of harassment, which doesn't only stay sometimes within the online world, but interviewees also had to face the potential of being physically harmed. So this again was something that heterosexual women talked about, but also we had some gay men talking about. So for instance, the case of Constantine, he gave an interesting example, and he said that because many of the dating apps use location-based systems, he was once just outside in his neighborhood walking around with friends. When he came back home, someone messaged him to tell him that they saw him walking with his friends and kind of mocked him and make him feel unsafe in his own home and in his own neighborhood.
Great, thank you. So do you want to talk about the guides, Jaime?
Yeah, so we felt that, or particularly in the interviews, which Neta did the vast majority of, some of the participants asked us for advice on how to use dating apps. All of us met our partners on dating apps. And some of the participants asked us, what am I doing wrong? What can I do better? So we produced a guide, which is the one with hearts there, which essentially provides some quite commonsensical, but nonetheless research-based advice. Things like trusting your gut, looking out for red flags, not being okay with being harassed or discriminated, taking action against it, I mean, which is available also outside printed if you want to take it. And we've also produced a guide for healthcare providers and organizations who may be looking at partnering with dating apps and some of the ethical considerations that may involve. We've also produced a number of videos. There are 4 of them about thinking about using dating apps. What are the things you have to look out for? What are some of the things that you can and cannot do on dating apps? How are dating apps changing our world? And why may some people choose to use dating apps, the pros and the cons. They feature Brian and me in very nice clothing, so I encourage you to have a look at it. And they're very high production value. We were filming for 2 days.
Yeah, with a professional filming company,
Yes.
not one the university makes us walk around the campus in suits. That wasn't us. So do you want to go to the next slide?
Yeah,
one thing we did want to say is that we have quite a bit of data on discrimination on dating apps, thanks to Kian, who is here. So that data is
Bottom one.
both quantitative and qualitative. So if anyone is interested in that, yeah. Are we here? Okay. So what we've been talking about really are the kind of general issues as they come up around dating apps, more pre and post COVID restrictions. So we haven't gone through here's the pre, here's the COVID restrictions, here's the post. So what we've been talking about a lot of so far is, a lot of it comes from the post restrictions reflections. Now we're going to focus on the COVID restrictions period. And we should say that we started, well, one of the things we did is in the survey, we asked participants how satisfied they were with dating apps in terms of sexual desires, emotional needs, overcoming loneliness, and other, of course. Next slide. So in terms of satisfaction then, 40% felt that dating apps, where am I? Yeah, 40% felt that dating apps helped during the COVID period. and 23.9 felt that dating apps made it harder. Now, 41.1 feeling that it helped dating apps didn't mean that they necessarily satisfied their sexual, their sexual desires in terms of sexual practices. It could be that they were answering this in a very broad way as well. I would never have sexual interactions with people. So, I mean, we have to start looking at that data in more depth before we actually kind of unpack that. Fulfilling emotional needs, of all participants, 53% felt dating apps during the COVID restrictions period helped with fulfilling emotional needs. That was higher among non-heterosexual women, 64%, and higher than for heterosexual men and women among non-heterosexual men, and lowest amongst heterosexual women and men. Excuse the use of non-heterosexual here. What we mean are LGBTQ. One of our, as I said at the very beginning of today, one of the ways in which we were thinking about resilience was also its links to loneliness. So for all participants, for 62% of participants felt that dating apps helped to overcome loneliness to some extent. This was highest, again, amongst non-heterosexual women, followed by heterosexual women, non-heterosexual men, and heterosexual men. And there are reasons for that, which I think will become clear. Do you want to? So I think, is this you? Go for it.
Is it that? No, let's go.
See your choreography is.
So one of the interesting parts that we found, at least interesting to me, I found, was how some patterns changed during the pandemic, at least based on the reports and the interviews or the accounts. So again, as we said, and as I assume that all of you know, here in the UK and obviously in other parts of the world, there were restrictions and people, depending on the time, were not able to leave their homes. And therefore, as we said, people use dating apps a bit more or more often. And something interesting happened during that time, which is, if we talked about before, how people kind of followed those very normative scripts about love. So heterosexual women are very interested in finding love, long-term partners, whereas heterosexual men were interested in sex and just that. This changed during the pandemic because people were not able to meet face-to-face. Conversations were elongated. So if before people try to swipe very quickly, try to find someone who maybe will be able to date them today, this evening, or tomorrow, or next week, this time it was not possible. So conversations were very long and much more in-depth. And because there wasn't the purpose of meeting in the foreseeable future, people didn't expect anything from that conversation other than finding some kind of comfort with someone else. So we found something that I called or termed slow intimacy. So again, it's that thing of not trying to jump into anything, not trying to get anything out of the other person. It's only wanting to get to know them and feel some kind of, like a support and connectedness. So as I was saying, or in different words, it was a more dialogical intimacy. So it was mostly conversation based, and it was more friend-like, but maybe not even so. It was just, it didn't need to have a name or a title to what this relationship is. The whole idea was just to connect. Next, please. Thank you. So these are a few examples of that. And again, I will say that because the heterosexual women were looking for something that was a bit more long-term, they were the ones who described it in the most positive way and felt like they gained the most out of that kind of slow intimacy. So for instance, Sharon said that it was slightly different because they weren't ready to jump in your knickers because you can't see, you weren't allowed to meet. So basically, I think the men seemed to be more chatty. So this was what heterosexual women wanted all along. They were just not able to get that. And the pandemic kind of made that a bit more available to them. Next, please. Sorry. Thanks. I think that's my last slide. But that was not just the case for heterosexual women, even though they were the majority. There were some heterosexual men or some gay men who also said that this was a very pleasant experience and something that they didn't experience before on dating apps. So if you remember, Yodit was actually mentioned a few slides before. I pay attention because I remember all of them. But before the pandemic, he said very explicitly and very openly that he was mostly interested in sex or something that is casual and short term, wasn't looking for anything beyond that. But that changed during the pandemic. He was confined to his flat, feeling very lonely. And he said how suddenly the conversations were, again, very meaningful, much more in depth. So he said, the conversations were never CV. We didn't talk about how you look like. It was like, how are you getting on? Are you working? So basically what he described, he said that suddenly dating apps were, as he called it, a network of support. So again, it wasn't trying to find someone for sex or thinking about like looks or heights or anything like that. It was just connecting and finding comfort.
Before we move to loneliness, we can explain, and I'm not entirely sure if it will come up again in the presentation. As you can see, we have this very well rehearsed because we made the mistake of changing the presentation yesterday night. But even though women in particular reported higher levels of satisfaction with the kinds of interactions they were having during COVID, this did not hold after COVID. And we saw, as you might have remembered from the motivations, that things came back to almost a pre-COVID situation quite quickly after COVID. And there's a lot to unpack there about the narrative in the UK of going back to normal and all these things. But there is a sense that even though people seem to potentially have been happier during COVID in dating apps, the businesses themselves very quickly changed gears to go back to the kind of dynamics of and interactions that were happening before COVID. So that's quite an interesting point that ties in with what Sharif was talking about, what the businesses want versus what the users want.
I mean, as I said at the beginning, one of our interests and the title for today is around resilience. And we actually used two measures. One was around loneliness and one was around resilience. So this is this the UCLA it's called? Or, yes. Yeah. The UCLA loneliness measure. So each category has three. So this is post, this is pre, this is during, post COVID restrictions, okay? And it goes like that across for the categories of sexuality and gender. If the rank is above 6, the score, then that indicates loneliness, degree of loneliness. Yeah. So what we find is that heterosexual men are least, this is where I am not sure about measures like this, to be honest. This is where heterosexual men report very little degrees of loneliness compared to heterosexual, non-heterosexual men, heterosexual women, and non-heterosexual women, who rank highest generally on all of these. If we look at the COVID era, then there is some movement towards, or some movement which includes loneliness amongst heterosexual men. It increases for non-heterosexual men, it increases further for heterosexual women, and increases further still for non-heterosexual women. And then post-COVID, what we find are that heterosexual men are less lonely than they ever were. Non-heterosexual men are less lonely, and heterosexual women are less lonely, and non-heterosexual women are less lonely are less lonely as well. My reservations about this is around the question of masculinity and femininity, and about how people may report or even have a language that they apply to their emotional lives. Much research, rightly or wrongly, suggests that women are more emotionally dialogical than men, and more emotionally reflexive. So in some respects, we might be a little suspicious about what these claim to report. There may be a case, and certainly it has been argued in some studies, that non-heterosexual women are more likely to be emotionally and generally more reflexive than any other group. So this might refer more to what I would call gendered and sexual habitus. That is the kind of way in which one makes sense of oneself, one lives in the world and so on, than it does as a factual reality. Whether that's, I present that to you as a possibility. So if we go to the next slide, and then we use the resilience measure. The resilience measure puts heterosexual men as more resilient than non-heterosexual men, who are more resilient than heterosexual women, who are more resilient than non-heterosexual women. What's really interesting about this is it contradicts a lot of the American research, which suggests that because of coming out and dealing with homophobia and so on and so forth, that non-heterosexual men and women have a greater capacity for resilience, or develop a greater capacity for resilience. I mean, that's always struck me, that literature is a bit kind of dodgy, to use another word, but I mean, it has used similar measures. So that's an interesting point as well. So I don't think that we can just simply rely on these measures to talk about resilience and loneliness. I think we have to really delve into the qualitative data, which is what we've done.
And another of the issues with these measures is that both the loneliness and the resilience ask questions such as how quickly and how well do you bounce back from tragic events in your life? How well do you cope with certain things, which are also profoundly material? Having a house, having a mortgage, or having to pay rent, having a job, not having a job, all those things have profound impacts on people's capacity to cope with things. So some of the further analysis we're looking at can do, really, is to compare these results with the material, the social, and the cultural capital that respondents evidence in their other responses.
Just next slide. So one of the things that I think is we need to rethink resilience, and I think in getting away from a kind of psychological model of resilience, we need to develop a more social model. And we're doing that by moving away, by drawing on concepts such as relational resilience that's been developed by Moore, which is recovery from challenges and threats, sustainability of well-being, and the ability to adapt, grow, and thrive. But also Fraser, prevailing despite hardship, effectively adapting, coping in stress-provoking situations, and ultimately prospering after adversity. The issue here about Fraser and Moore is that they embed their ideas within a more social model. So we've actually even developed this further, but at the point of putting this on the slide, we were thinking about intimate resilience as prevailing despite the obstacles that may present themselves to achieving the intimate kinds of relationships that people want, be they friendship, couples, sexual, so on. Effectively adapting to and coping with the challenges posed for intimate relationships, and the recovery from a sense of intimate disconnectedness and optimism about intimate possibilities in the future. But I think one of the key issues for us is this not only has to be embedded in the whole resource for resilience is not just about technology and dating apps, it's also about how embedded that is within the social and community contexts in which people operate.
And this is the content we're going to cover before lunch, but we now have 10-15 minutes for questions and for things that you may have questions about that we didn't pick up because we've run over this very quickly.
Hi, thanks so much. Really interesting. I've got questions here, sorry. I've got the earlier slide, which was the where we have dating, sex, the four motivations. Yeah. And forgive me, I'm not sure whether you have data on this or whether you have had a chance to look at all of the data. Sorry, the next one. But well, I mean, both of them, I suppose. What I was really interested in is obviously it makes sense that we have these four motivations here and you've got them mapped out, but presumably these are overlapping as well. I was wondering, and I think because rhythm got mentioned in our advisory meeting yesterday, and I was wondering whether this is a question for you, Neta. I was wondering, could you talk a little bit about the rhythms around that? Because I think that's really interesting, like how these kind of come together and overlap.
In terms of the rhythms, and I'm not sure, because we wrote an article about the rhythms of dating apps, and I don't know if it necessarily touched on how these things overlap, but it was more in terms of like how people are structured to perceive time in a certain way. And there's a time to date, and there's a time to have sex, and there's a time to get married, and everything has a date, it has a rhythm and a pattern. And so again, it's not necessarily overlapping, and perhaps that kind of rhythm is very heteronormative as well. But in the heteronormative sense, there's very much a structure in how long you're supposed to date before you have sex, and how long you're supposed to have sex until you get married, or whatever that is, and how that broke during the pandemic. And I think that was the moment where, again, not necessarily that these things overlapped, but they didn't have those titles anymore. It was just, let's get to know each other and we'll see what happens. And we don't know if it will be for friendship, or we don't know if it will end up being for sex. We just don't know. And we're just getting to know each other. So I hope that kind of answers your question, but I think Brian.
I mean, the other aspect is we do have that data and we haven't analyzed it. It's the basic. Kian, did you want to say something?
Yeah, so
This is Kian, who
Yeah.
does,
We-
who's our
We did
stats
also
expert.
dig into the data that we look at the different combinations,
Yeah.
whether people who choose to like going for dating, are they also going to likely choose that sex? So we find that the data is very, very messy. So there's just so many different combinations. So it does look like people don't go just using data just for a single purpose. It is more like to be multiple purposes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we do have that kind of top list motivations before COVID, the combination of motivation before COVID, during COVID, and post-COVID. But we don't see that much difference. It looks like it's always been kind of multiple use of the dating apps.
Yeah, but I would say that, you know, as you know better than most, is, you know, people certainly within LGBTQ cultures, there's the whole idea of sexual friendships. You know, dating is a kind of practice, but you know, friendship is entails or involves friendship practices, intimate practices, as does sex. So I think they're very blurred, basically. And the fact that people were choosing more than one meant that they were, you know, acknowledging that blurredness, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, this is really interesting stuff. I'm wondering if you've got data or you've looked at the issues around chronic illness and physical illness, because you talk about loneliness and resilience, but I mean, you're now seeing a lot more older people using these apps, and these are people who often have concomitant physical illness affecting both sexuality and their general health and their relationships. And I think, you know, that's another thing that would be very interesting to hear about.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So from the point of view of the survey, we asked both about people's disability, using the same question as the census does, whether that disability also impacted their capacity to, or their ability to socialize, to work, and to communicate. And also whether they had to shield during COVID, which in the UK is the kind of the awareness that you were at high risk of serious illness or death from COVID, and you had to stay at home in more strict social distance. And so we asked those questions, and we're looking at running analysis with that on the data of the survey. That's not yet been done. And on the interviews, I think Neta can talk about it.
Yeah, these are mostly anecdotes, but we did have several interviewees who had chronic illnesses, and people who we had, for instance, one interviewee who were basically told, if you go out on the street during COVID, you might die. Basically, it was that an intense period for them. And another one who had a daughter with multiple disabilities, and they talked to, I think it was interesting in terms of discrimination as well, and how difficult it was to find love when you have all these kind of extra things that you bring to the table. And so, yeah, so these are mostly anecdotes, but it was something that came up a lot in interviews, and it wasn't necessarily even to do with age. We also had younger interviewees who were facing these kinds of illnesses and talking about connecting to people online through dating apps. But again, it wasn't necessarily a positive experience, whereas they said, oh, this opens up such a, opens me up to such a large amount of people. I do remember one that was interesting. It was a very short interview with a lady who was also, I don't remember, she had several disabilities and even struggled talking. And I asked her about like finding a partner, and she said that she does not want to meet anybody with disabilities, that if someone with disability would be interested in dating her, she would not be interested. So that was an interesting thing, that someone that might experience that kind of discrimination is also passing it on to other people. Sorry, these are just anecdotes.
I mean, it should be said, as you probably know well, is that illness and disability are blurred categories themselves. So people will say they are disabled often, and we might have previously saw that as illness. So yeah, that's just a point.
There's a question. There are a few questions there.
Did you
use any, have you analyzed your qualitative data yet, all the way through? Did you use some of your quant to bring to your interviews? So did you like talk, do you see that and then interview your participants about it?
That has been a point of contention in the team. Not a point of contention, but that it's been difficult to figure out how we are putting in conversation both sources of data. Initially, I think I thought the quantitative data could enlighten the kinds of questions we could be asking, and that we would compare and somewhat contrast one another. I think over time we've developed an approach that's more based on putting them in conversation without necessarily questioning the validity of each data set, because it doesn't say the same thing than the other. So in general, there are things that resonate across sets. For example, the loneliness, the highest scores of loneliness in the survey do seem to match with people's actual telling us that they feel lonely, or that letting us know that they feel lonely in multiple ways. These ideas of men being more interested in sex than women also match up with the surveys, with the interviews, but we haven't sought to kind of question one thing and the other. And that was particularly interesting. Among the first few people we interviewed, they were sampled from the people who responded to the survey. So there was a temptation for us to look at their survey responses and be like, you said this, but now you're telling me this other thing. And when are you lying? But we resisted that urge, mostly.
Yeah, participants don't lie, by the way. They may
They
tell a
do.
different narrative in a different context, but
I don't know if you would have the qualitative data for this, but like looking at the different graphs, I'm trying to figure out, what might influence this kind of the different changes. I wonder if it's partly around the different, and I think you touched on it in the presentation, but the different scripts that were available during lockdown. So you've automatically got a, oh, furlough's great, isn't it? Or, oh, lockdown, like, how are you feeling about it? You've already got those kind of jumping points.
Yeah.
So I wonder if that then changed people's abilities to look for friends more, or come across as kind of whimsical in terms of the dating stuff. And then again, I wonder if that fed, and if you have the data for this, if that then fed into the motivations afterwards. It's like, oh, this is how one interacts in these online environments. Like, it's not that hard. Yeah, don't know if you could speak to that.
I mean, I think, yeah, you've hit on something there. I mean, that's actually was explicitly said by some participants that they had common ground to talk about. So that helped, obviously. I mean, what's interesting is, just in terms of your last point there, is how all that radically changed as soon as restrictions were over. According to participants, it just went right back, that dating apps functioned and people interacted in the same way, or as one participant put it, they all went back to being children. There was a rush back to previous practices. So I don't know if that answers.
I would also add that at all points, both the quantitative and the interviews were retrospective. So there's an element of narration that has to be taken there. They narrated the past to make sense of a present moment. But beyond that, there's also an element of different apps creating those scripts during COVID. So some participants would tell us that their apps send them messages, do not meet with people, or send them guidance. If you're going to meet with people, do this or do that. So there are different scripts that also apps as businesses themselves created and made available to people. And there's a whole element there, which we've been talking for the past couple of days, around the stigma associated with using dating apps and the willingness of certain people or certain communities to recognize the use of dating apps for sex or not, or using them for dating or not. So there's a lot there to unpack about who says what and what makes it possible for them to say that.
As a follow-up then, do you know if a particular dating app was used during lockdown?
Not yet, but we will. The issue with that is that we have such a wide array of dating apps. Except for the top 3 or 4, the rest is a huge array of apps that are very niche. So it's difficult to run those analyses, as far as I think, because of the large groups of small numbers.
No,
Yeah.
no, someone.
So let's go with Max first.
Thank you. Really, really interesting data. I hope you'll forgive me for asking a more theoretical question. I'm also a theory nerd, and you've, in this morning's presentation and in this presentation, keep referring to Bourdieusian concepts, access to resources, capitals, habitus, and so on. And I just want to kind of think about how you're analyzing these results. And of course, one of the most common metaphors that's used for dating apps is that it's like a marketplace, right?
Yeah.
And we're seeing lots of Marxist and post-Marxist frameworks coming through in what you're saying. So I just wondered if you could speak to that a little bit, and also whether you'd thought about applying frameworks such as the symbolic economy of desire, the symbolic economy of intimacy, some of these sorts of frameworks to your data as well.
Well, I can say, our kind of theoretical approach is pick and mix. And so let me say there's an element of symbolic interactionism within our approach here, but also an analysis of, I suppose, let's say, a post-structurally minded analysis of power as a flow. So in terms of Bourdieu, I think we tend to think, I hope we tend to think, that we tend to talk in terms of resources as opposed to capitals. So Bourdieu is really interesting if you look at the field and you look at the various kind of transmissibility or non-transmissibility of capitals within the field. But I am never wholly convinced by Bourdieu, I have to say. And I think the key question for me and for us is really about, comes back to that question about, we were talking with Sheriff earlier. I mean, put very simply, our theoretical approach, I think, is more attuned in this instance to the kind of neoliberal critique. And we use our theory as a toolbox to mobilize that. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but you can drill us later on that, the detail.
You had a question?
Hi, Hunter from the Creative Computing Institute. I think you hinted that you have some interesting data on race, but you have excluded that from this current presentation. But I'm stuck with that for obvious reasons. And I wonder, how does race and disability, class, etc., how does it intersect with the ability to maintain resilience, particularly given the context that marginalized communities, multiple people with multiple marginality factors were more prone to contract COVID and have complications.
Yeah.
Would you care to expand on that?
Well, I think what we haven't done is the analysis in terms of race or class, or, we're working on those at the moment with Kian. So to me, it's obvious that these are really important and they're going to shape, the possibilities and opportunities for resilience. And I suppose we have touched a little on, the whole issue of discrimination on dating apps, be that explicit or implicit, does have impacts for people feeling included, excluded, or whether they will use certain apps or not. But to be honest, we haven't started to do that analysis yet. I think I was saying to someone earlier, I think we want to do a class analysis, we want to do a race analysis, and a combined interaction analysis of both, or intersectional analysis. But we haven't done it yet.
Thank you.
Are there questions from the online?
The online people, yeah, there are.
There are questions from. Okay.
There were people who wanted to know more about the rhythms of dating. If you want.
Okay.
Should we?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So we'll take a question from online and then.
That was the question. They wanted
So the
to know
question
more.
was about the rhythms of dating, which is Neta's area of expertise.
Well, well, I said a little bit, but basically, time was something. The concept of time was something that was mentioned a lot in the interviews, and also I don't remember if Brian mentioned that how precious people were about their time and how they don't want to waste time in finding the right partner or to waste time using dating apps for too long. The idea was to go in and out and finding whatever it was they're looking for. And therefore, they wanted to do everything very quickly. So as I said before about the rhythm of like, how long are we going to text each other? There were the people who said, I'm not going to text to someone for like 3 weeks now. We're either texting and meeting or we're not going to keep texting because I'm not going to waste my time on someone that when I end up meeting them, I will realize that they're not the right person for me. And then therefore I wasted all these 3 weeks on that person. So again, as I said, everything was kind of like a zero-sum game. If I'm wasting my time on you, I won't be able to dedicate my time on someone else. Which was interesting that it was the emotional part of dating was not discussed that much. It was mostly just, I don't want to waste my time. So again, we can talk about maybe how capitalism is intersected with all of this, intersects with this kind of discussion about the heart. Other than that, I'm just trying to kind of wrap up everything I said and I wrote in that article. And again, basically, it was so interesting how everything slowed down. And everybody seemed, at least, not everybody, but many of the interviewees were so happy with this rhythm of taking things very slow and getting to know someone, and then straight away they abandoned the whole thing because again, time was running out. Let's just meet the right person and get married and have children or whatever that was.
Or, let's have that sex right now kind of thing. Exactly. But I think, the time and productivity, I suppose, are the key issues here. Is this productive outside of in ordinary times, in extraordinary times where people are also using dating apps to kill time? There is more space to, what one could say, there may be more space to slow the rhythm down, but also I do think people were looking for emotional support and were lonely, so it's a combination of those factors, I think.
As you can see, this is very much a living project that we're still thinking through. So all of the questions that you ask are really useful. There's also a question at the back afterwards, but yeah, you can ask a quick question.
I hope it's good. I was interested that in the first presentation that we started with, you cited Steph Duguay's paper about like changed features of the apps during COVID and stuff. And then I was curious, particularly in the interviews, but also maybe in your survey, did participants talk about certain features, perhaps specifically during COVID that they utilized and then either abandoned, or something around like the features shaping their experience, either like the during or the after parts?
Do you want to?
Yeah. Because it was something that seemed very minor, but something that I found very interesting, at least, was the COVID vaccine badge, which is something that some of the dating app platforms incorporated, and that was in order to promote the vaccine and get people to vaccinate, or to show as if they care if people are vaccinated or not. And that turned into something very interesting to me, at least, that people started excluding people based on if they were vaccinated or not, or if they had the badge or not. And it turned into quite a heated discussion among themselves or with the other users about the vaccine. So that was a feature that was used. And what was interesting is that when I did the interviews, the badge was still there on the app. And but it was during a time when, COVID was not a big deal anymore, let's say. And while they had such heated debates and strong arguments against or in favor of the badge in the vaccine, when I did the interviews and asked, and now, do you care? Will you date someone who has the badge? You will start talking to them. They said, oh, I don't care anymore. But they cared so much just a few months before, and the feature is still there, but suddenly it serves no purpose at all. So that's an example of something that was implemented and maybe is still there, but nobody cares about.
And this is also a massive pet peeve of mine, right? Because during COVID, there was a time in which apps explored and experimented with different features. Beyond that, which Grindr, for example, have been doing for a long time, Grindr implemented a group chat feature, which goes to address some of Shari's points about, but that appeared and disappeared. And there is no record whatsoever that it ever happened. And it was, everybody I talked to, it didn't come up in the interviews, everybody I talked to, profoundly transformational and innovative and different and problematic. But there was a time in which things could have happened and they didn't. And it's really interesting how we talk about transformations and revolutions during COVID, but the apps themselves and the way they work didn't allow for that. Yeah, a last question.
Sorry, I think we're a bit short on time, aren't we? I have a few questions which hopefully can be answered in brief. They're about like methods and data analysis. So one of which is like, did you think about the app walkthrough method at all in terms of making sense of these like socio-technical interfaces and how they're shaping like the possibilities of intimacy? Second question is around like between the quantitative and the qualitative data. So given that some of your interviewees were from the survey, could you trace them, like could you identify them in the survey? And then kind of as an extension of that, in terms of data analysis, how do you make sense of it when they contradict themselves? And also, how do you make sense of some of the other like incongruences between your quantitative data and your qualitative data? And also some of the quantitative data that kind of goes against some of like the normative claims about, say, like heterosexual men, for instance. Like I was really shocked that their reported levels of loneliness were so low. So like, how have you approached that in general?
So to answer the first one about the app walkthrough, we thought about using that, but then we chose not to because we sought to do all the interviews through Zoom and even some on telephone. So we felt it would have been difficult technically to do that. It would have been very interesting to look at all these different apps that people were using, but there was also the issue that at the time at which they were doing the interview, they may no longer be app users. The only criteria was for them to have been app users during COVID. In terms of tracing them, initially we thought we could, and we had quite a significant number, around 100 to 200 people who completed the survey, who volunteered to, or who said they were interested in being interviewed. Eventually, I think only like 5-10 people more.
Probably about 20.
20 came through to the interview, but we chose not to trace them back because we felt it would be very easy to then in the interview to question them and be like, you said this, no, you're saying this other thing, and we don't want to do that. In terms of incongruencies, we found a lot, but if we go with this idea of a narrative that people are creating, oftentimes they are creating it at the same time as we are asking questions. We are co-creating it with them. We have a paper hopefully coming out at some point about how we co-created the data that we were collecting in a way. There is an issue there about where do we draw the boundary line between participants creating their own stories to make sense of their experiences and trying to create a coherent narrative to tell us, and participants making things up because they didn't have any experience whatsoever of what we were asking them. But that's a very interesting boundary point.
I mean, I've done lots of face-to-face interviews over the last 30 years. And when you sit with the participant and you're interviewing them face to face, one interview, there will be several contradictions within that interview. So in a sense, you have to take the narrative on the page. And, there's no point in saying, oh, is that true? I mean, you can, if you're lucky enough and you want to kind of probe it, that's great. But when it comes to the analysis and you're looking at the data on the page, I think you need to take that. And when you see those contradictions, you actually flag them up as opposed to ignoring them. I don't think there's a perfect way to deal, also we are contradictory, we contradict ourselves all the time. So unless it's like, unless in one interview they say, I'm a trans woman, and you interview them and then they say, oh, actually I'm a man, you might say, oh, well, there's something there, that you might want to explore, how that mobility of identity, or the mobility of memory. I mean, I do think we need to, we have planned to do this anyway, but I think the whole issue of memory is an interesting one and may actually be the root of what one might call inconsistencies.
That said, we also encountered what is now called imposter participants, or we suspect we encountered them, and that's something we can talk about over lunch or after, because it's something we've grappled with